Welcome to today's webcast. This call is being recorded, and at this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Chris Flack. Please go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much, everybody in our audience, for joining us for today's webcast, 7 Proven Best Practices for Protecting Against Ransomware, sponsored by Veeam Software. I'm Chris Flack with Redmond Mag, and I'm here to be your host for today's event, so thank you all for joining. Just a few quick things before we get started with today's broadcast and get our presentation underway, just a couple quick reminders. So first things first is we are recording today's presentation for future viewing and listening purposes. We'll send you a link within about 24 to 48 hours once the broadcast is over where you can find the replay. We encourage you to share that link with coworkers, colleagues, friends, anybody who may be interested on today's topic. We'd greatly appreciate that. Also, today's webcast will feature a Q&A session at the end in a formal manner, but we do encourage you to please participate with us along the way. If you have a question for our presenter, please feel free to enter it at any time, and hopefully we'll get to your questions as we go along and at the end of the presentation. But don't be shy. Feel free to participate with us as we go along in the presentation today. We really enjoy that. Joining us for today's webcast speaking is going to be a really great presenter. His name is Greg Shields, and he's a globally recognized expert on systems management, virtualization, and cloud technologies. He's a multiple-year recipient of the Microsoft MVP, VMware vExpert, and Citrix CTP awards, and has been a contributing editor for Redmond Magazine and Virtualization Review, as well as a former co-chair for Tech Mentor events, and is a frequent speaker at IT conferences worldwide. Greg is just really an awesome guy as well, and he gives really great presentations. So without any further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Greg. So please take the floor, my friends.
No, don't set the bar too high today, Chris.
No, I won't, man. You always give a good presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. As Chris said, yeah, my name is Greg Shields, and although I am not an employee or associated with Veeam Software, the guys over at Veeam, the folks over at Veeam, did ask me to come on to talk a bit about this, what I believe to be a pretty interesting topic of ransomware. Almost morbidly interesting, I guess I could say. And more specifically, not just the fact that it exists, but also just some of the things that you can do, that really you can implement today to help protect your data from ransomware. Very specifically here, I want to talk about 7 best practices that in some cases are going to be kind of self-explanatory. In some cases are going to be things that you might go, oh, wait a minute, that makes a lot of sense. But in every case will be ones that in some situations you may not have actually implemented and can do so today to help protect yourself and specifically your data from the impact of a ransomware type event. I want to start first by just talking a bit about the old days, right? I don't know, I've been around for a while here, and are you with me? Do you remember a day back when malware was quite a bit less impactful than it seemingly has been today? Gosh, I remember a day when malware would go through and just crash machines. I remember a day when malware would even go as far as to crash networks. But the data itself was, in the early days, the data itself was not all that often really the target of the destruction. Things have evolved quite a bit over the years. We've gone from malware that just did nefarious things there on your systems to malware that then destroyed systems to now malware that propagates in very strange and curious ways with the goal of extorting real, actual money out of you, an individual person. I talk about this new ransomware threats because, well, we're starting to see more and more of this as a mechanism to deploy out these really bad pieces of software with the end goal of actually monetizing the result. Ransomware is just like any other piece of malware, adware, spyware, whatever you want to call it, any of the bad pieces of code that are out there, in that they have the usual same kinds of mechanisms for distribution. They spread around through email attachments or as worms once they get inside your network. They're delivered there from different websites. Really, any of the ways in which you interact with the rest of the world can be a potential vector for a malware or specifically a ransomware attack. The difference is in the payload. Here with our new ransomware threats, and this is really nothing you don't already know, it's the payload itself that goes through forcibly encrypting the data on your device. If you're used to tools that do full disk encryption, even Microsoft has its tools for doing this. This is essentially the same process of fully encrypting the disk and all the contents therein, and then not giving you the unlock code to be able to actually get access to that data once it's been encrypted. It then being encrypted means that's, well, because of encryption being the way that it is, there really is no way to get that information back without receiving the key, the password, as it were, that unlocks that drive and presents back access there to your information. The attacker also sometimes, in certain payloads, will sometimes threaten to leak sensitive information as well. So in the case of an infection, there may be, or there will be, this encryption process for the drive, but there may also be this leaking of sensitive information either to the attacker or to third parties as well. And those payloads these days, as they're getting more and more intelligent, are combining different encryption techniques to lock you and really your administrators, anyone else out around from the folders and the files, and even from managed file transfer, and disabling you from the old tactics of removing the drive and slaving it to another system to then get access to those individual files and folders. So the nefariousness of these ransomware attacks just keeps getting more and more intelligent as time has gone on. The assumption here on the part of the attacker, or the person who's using these tools that are now becoming available for creating them, is that whatever data is being encrypted, in and amongst all that the stuff that's being encrypted, there's enough data that's in there that's important enough that you, the user, the affected user, will then pay to recover that data. I have just a history lesson here, just a couple of really interesting bits of history as it relates to this whole ransomware evolution. And I talk here about some of the original, I guess, the very first entrants in terms of ransomware. In fact, ransomware is as old as, at least what is generally recognized, is as old as around the late 80s. There was a piece of ransomware called PC Cyborg back in 1989 that was invented, quote unquote, by an individual named Dr. J.L. Pop, which, according to the story, this individual was, in fact, an evolutionary biologist who was at a particular biology conference there, and in an attempt to increase his notoriety, actually walked around the conference and distributed malware-infected disks into the different delegates there in the hope that they'd then pay the, whatever, $189, I think the story goes, to have their computer repaired. That was not entirely a ransomware attack, but many individuals assumed this to be kind of the origination of the ransomware story. Right around 2012 is when we started to see the use then of actual ransomware attacks and the different scams like what we're seeing here today. In 2012, a major ransomware Trojan known as Reviton began to spread. It was based off of a Trojan called Citadel, with the payload displaying a warning purportedly from a law enforcement agency that claimed the computer had been used for illegal activities. And so this piece of malware would just lock up the computer without the user's knowledge, freeze that computer, and pop up this bogus FBI icon there on people's computers saying that you'd violated federal law. And in order to unlock the computer, you had to pay that fine. From there, we get to 2014 with CryptoWall and also CryptoLocker. CryptoLocker was a really super ransomware indicated in a change in the way that the actual bad guys were thinking about ransomware. With CryptoLocker, it was spread by malicious downloads from websites and also email attachments. And the content of those locations was engineered to really encourage some sort of action on the part of the victim. So this whole CryptoLocker was one of the first times, and also then CryptoWall, was one of the first times that we saw ransomware utilizing e-currency, so Bitcoin or whatever other e-currencies that are out there, there are many, as the method of payments in order to actually extort them that information back. That takes us here to 2014, and then lately these ransomware as a service toolkits that now exist and are being distributed by the bad guys to then create very easily a mechanism for people to customize and then deliver their own mechanisms of ransomware out into the world. Ransomware these days is, as you've obviously seen, I mean, you're here in this webinar, is a growing threat as individuals realize that, well, we're not going to get our data back unless we then pay the ransom or have some other mechanisms in place to then recover that data when it is required. And so that kind of brings us to the point here, right? So I've spent the first 9 or so minutes here talking about malware, but isn't this a webinar that's sponsored by Veeam? That is kind of the question here. And if you know Veeam, Veeam has not really historically been a company that's been in the malware business or the anti-malware business. Veeam, for all of us, for nearly all of us, is recognized as being the backup and recovery solution company. And although with these webinars, I tend not to talk about the product itself. Again, I'm not a Veeam employee by any means. I think it's important here to kind of focus in on some of the interesting stuff that is why we're here on a webinar talking about malware that happens to be sponsored by a backup and recovery company. I'll talk first about a study, actually one that I've kind of borrowed some of the results here from Veeam. Back in 2016, Veeam did a study of nearly 900 IT organizations. And of these were, I believe these were all Veeam customers. Out of those, not quite half of them were faced with some form of ransomware in the last 2 years. Of those, so of that 46%, those with an incident, 91% had their data encrypted. And out of that, 83% indicated that the attack encrypted the really important data, so their mission-critical data. But only 2% of these individuals admitted to paying the ransom. Now, that can be because no one wants to admit that they paid the ransom, or that can be because some of these individuals had compensating mechanisms in place to prevent the necessity of paying that ransom. Of those 2%, all but one paid less than $10,000. And this last one here, I guess this goes without saying, again, these are Veeam customers, but out of this study here, 84% of the respondents who were Veeam customers were able to recover their data without paying the ransom. The long and short here is, I guess what I want to tell you is that the ransomware story, although it is wrapped in a malware storyline, the ransomware story is today, in fact, a data protection story. It's for that reason here that I want to talk about these 7 proven best practices. For most of us, if you've been around for any period of time, if you've done data protection, backup, and recovery for really any period of time, these best practices haven't evolved since really the beginnings of tape backup, the backup and recovery. But they become ever more important today when we start thinking about the different ways or reasons why we need to back up and potentially then recover our data. Let's talk a bit about 7 things that you can then implement today. So right now here today, as soon as we get done with this webinar, that can do a better job of protecting the data that you have, not just from ransomware, but really from any of the potential vectors, even just an inadvertent deletion, so that you can get that data back or across this broad spectrum of different vulnerabilities. I'll talk first here about the first one, and that has to do with using or utilizing different credentials there for your backup storage. We've heard, or we've talked a lot about in this industry about least privilege. Least privilege has been around as a concept for decades at this point. But least privilege in the context of ransomware, in the context of any malware, becomes fundamentally important when you start talking about protecting then the data, the files and folders that exist perhaps on other servers in the environment from those that exist on the machines that are vulnerable. I'll step back from that, right? So I've got desktops out there. I may have some servers out there as well, and my users are going about doing their everyday activities. When those users do those activities and download the bad attachment or go to the bad website and the ransomware attack occurs, there is also the spread of that ransomware malware going through the network that can become a really bad problem. Separating out the credentials you use for backup storage from those that you use from your everyday activities, even those associated with administrator accounts, is one of the proven best ways that you can protect yourself from a rapidly spreading piece of malware from making its way through individual workstations into your server network and then onto your backup server machines. This is even more important these days as many organizations have moved from tape backup as the only thing that they use towards disk-to-disk backup as the primary backup target for the data that they're collecting. And so long and short here is if you have administrator accounts, which you do, if you have backup accounts, if you have even the hardware-based accounts that are on whatever piece of hardware that you're using, separate those so that you use different credentials for your backup storage than what you do for everything else. Number 2 here is one that, again, a very old solution here, one that is the same whether you're talking about everyday backups and recovery or whether you're talking about actually ransomware itself. This is the use of the 3-2-1 rule, which actually is kind of the 3-2-1-1 rule, technically. When you're doing your backups, when you're setting up the architecture for how you do backups there, this 3-2-1, also 1 rule is a great way to ensure that you have multiple different copies of the data in different locations. And it's just a mnemonic. Create 3 different topics or 3 different copies of data. So make sure that you always have 3 different copies of the data that you have. For those 3 different copies, make sure that they're on two different types of media. So as you can see there with the icons, on disk and also on tape. One of those types of media, at least one of those types, is then off-site. So whether that be a tape drive in some secondary location, whether that be up in the cloud, whether that be in a data center that you have down the street or in some other part of the planet, having that in a different location on a different piece of media that happens to be off-site is also very important. And then the last one here is having one copy that is also offline. A second ago, I talked about separating out those backup credentials so that a propagating piece of malware can't make its way into the backup data. Well, if you have all of your copies there online, you also have a vulnerability because that propagation can make its way to the online data. Making sure that you create one or establish one of your 3 copies of data as being a fully offline air-gapped piece of data ensures that even if you have a situation where every single machine gets corrupted, you still have a copy of that data in some air-gapped location that you can use for recovery. So this 3-2-1 rule, again, this is the same thing whether it's ransomware or your everyday backup and recovery, but it's a great approach for ensuring that no major incident is going to impact your entire company all at once. This goes to our third item here, include offline storage in your data protection strategy. That is the final one of the 3-2-1-1. As I said, making sure that there is some measure of offline storage in a secondary location if possible will help protect you, or is a good part of that data protection strategy for any situation where any of these incidents can occur. It's also worthwhile to talk about as you think through this 3-2-1-1 approach. Having 3 different copies of data is useful, but having 3 different copies of data where the different copies are on the same operating system or on the same file system really doesn't do you much good. If you have some propagating piece of malware that's moving around through those systems, if it can move to one of the file systems, well, it will probably be able to move to the second of the same kinds of file systems. This is segmenting things by OS. Set up one backup system with Windows, another backup system with Linux. Use a third-party hardware vendor's file system as the storage location for your data with its segregated credentials, with its segregated just ways in which it stores the files there on disk. If you have different file systems on different devices using different hardware and entirely different languages for storage, you are, again, better prepared for one of these incidents where something begins to propagate. You hear me use that term propagate quite a bit, and this notion of, well, how these pieces of malware move around the network. Obviously, a ransomware attack also has the virus part of the malware. The encryption is just the payload. The virus is the part that replicates around. And so this one is kind of a soft one, I guess, out of the 7 that are there, but ensuring that you have visibility across your entire infrastructure of what your perspective, what your whole view is on the malware landscape is important for identifying early when you find a person that comes in and says, wait a minute, I think I actually have something that's going wrong. This is a solution. There are many solutions out there, Veeam and otherwise, that support visibility for malware and other types of strange attacks that are going on. But having some way to really peek into the individual desktops and servers as well as the network there can help you shut down a propagation before it ends up going from your desktops to your servers. I'll talk here about the backup copy job as well. This is a certain type of job. This is not unique to Veeam, but it's really any backup solution that's out there. The backup copy job effectively just takes a copy of a backup and then moves it to copies it to some alternative location. Backup copy jobs are great because they present another copy, another entire location for that data that can add additional restore points depending on how you set up the timing. And so in your 3-2-1, also 1 configuration, your whole architecture, you can use backup copy jobs as a mechanism to then create those additional replicants of that data to add additional restore points for bringing yourself back online. And then lastly is just education. The idea of making sure that everyone is aware of what a ransomware event is and how to protect yourself from it. I remember situations in my history, and maybe you have as well, where a user from outside the network brought in their laptop and plugged it into the network to show you that the problem was occurring. I've actually had to recover from situations where exactly that problem has occurred. Just simple education on the part of the user, letting them know what these things are, is one way in which you can ensure that they don't do things that further propagate in ways that you don't appreciate or really want to have happen. These days, as environments move towards more technology-oriented solutions for dealing with security, you find it all too often where many IT organizations have stepped away from just raw education for users. I talk to a lot of people these days who used to do education programs on malware and other types of protective measures that don't so more as they lean more and more on technical solutions. But good old education for users is really one of the best ways that you can help them understand where not to go, what not to do, and how not to bring this stuff inside, as well as what to do during those initial triage situations right immediately after the incident occurs. And so you can't really push education too much, but educate your users there to help avoid that propagation. This takes us essentially through these 7 proven best practices. As I said, this is a ransomware story, but the reality is that the ransomware story is a data protection story. If you have the functionality, which presumably you do, because these days everyone has a backup and recovery solution that they either like or in many cases that they don't, but there are various reconfigurations that you can apply, like what we've talked here, to help start protecting your data now. As Chris said, my name is Greg Shields, multiple-year Microsoft MVP and vExpert. I want to thank Veeam for the opportunity to come talk with you here for a few minutes about this whole ransomware threat. And at that, somewhere on your screen, I believe, you should have an Ask a Question box. If you have a couple of questions here, I've got one already here in the queue. If you have questions here regarding ransomware or some of the more general topics regarding data protection, please feel free to throw those there in the Q&A box. As I said, I can't talk much about any of the Veeam products specifically because I am not a Veeam employee, but if we've got some questions here, maybe we can work through those that are coming here in my question box. Question here from Mitch. Sleeper ransomware is popping up. How can you ensure that you aren't backing up such malware along with your good data accidentally? I think Mitch, when you're referring to sleeper malware, you're talking about some of the more insidious ways in which these different viruses, these different pieces of malware are propagating throughout the network. You kind of tend to, and just describing sleeper malware for a bit, you can kind of tend to create a parallel between the differences of, for example, the common cold and the Ebola virus. In the case of the Ebola virus, it is fast propagating, and it is also almost nearly immediately deadly or extremely problematic for the individual that happens to catch that particular virus. And so one of the things about viruses that are extremely impactful, like Ebola, is that while they do spread very rapidly, the impact or the awareness of their spreading becomes, well, it becomes easy to understand that there actually is a situation going on. This contrasts with the common cold, where sometimes you don't even know that you have it until far past the situation of contagion. And so what happens with the common cold? Everybody ends up getting it. This talks a bit about how some of these newer pieces of ransomware are not immediately, automatically, and quickly then going through the encryption process of deploying their payload and then locking up all that data. Your question then is, how can you ensure you aren't backing up such malware along with your good data automatically? And that goes back to our whole 3-2-1-1 rule, as well as the restore points that go along with those rules. If I go back to 3-2-1-1, let me bring up the slide here once again. The idea of 3-2-1-1 is having 3 different copies of data on 2 different parts of media, one of which is off-site and one of which is online or offline. And when you're creating these with the backup solutions you have today, you have the abilities to create restore points at previous points in time. Once that piece of sleeper malware actually presents itself, once your antivirus recognizes it, or once the first machine actually shows the encryption actually occurring, it's there which you'll begin to go backwards in time to try to figure out exactly when the initial malware, the attack, the insertion occurred there into your network. I talked earlier about making sure that you had good awareness of the changes that was going on the network. Those sorts of solutions, like network solutions that can identify the signatures and behaviors of that propagation, can assist with that. But from the backup perspective, from the data protection perspective, it's the use of those individual restore points that makes it handy for helping you go backwards in time to figure out where the original data occurred before it ended up being before the virus ended up being incorporated there with that data. Other questions there? I don't see other further questions here in the queue. But at this point then, I'd like to thank Veeam, our sponsor here, for just giving us an opportunity to talk a bit about the different approaches to use, the different best practices to use in implementing whatever backup and recovery solution you have today to help protect yourself against the scourge, the ever-growing scourge of malware. As you can see there on the screen, I've got a slide there from Veeam that talks about some of their actually relatively new ransomware content that exists. And if you take a look there at veeam.com, they've got a couple of great white papers you can download, then identified by vertical, to give you more information here about what we've talked about. Again, my name is Greg Shields, and with that, I'd like to turn things back over to Chris Flack for some closing thoughts. Chris?
Hey, thank you so much for everything today, Greg. Really appreciate it. For your time today. Thanks for an excellent presentation. Thank you to everybody who participated with us in the presentation today. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast, which has been sponsored by Veeam Software. Don't forget, you could go down to the slide deck, to the resource tab at the bottom of your screen to get today's slide deck, to get a copy of the slide. It will have all the information and links on where you can find more information about what Veeam has to offer for you. So thank you so much for your attendance today, everybody. Today's webcast has been sponsored by Veeam Software and brought to you by redmondmag.com. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody. Take care.